The second lecture this semester in the series known as the Gale Collaborative on Jewish Life in the Americas covers Jewish issues in US, Canada, and Latin America, all in the same series. I'm Naomi Lindstrom. I'm the director of this series at the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies. And our director is Tatiana Lichtenstein, who's in black and white, if you want to observe her picture. So our speaker today is Andrew Porwancher. He's the Wick Cary Associate Professor at OU, where he's in the Department of Classics and Letters. And of course, he's at our sister Schusterman Center at OU. So this is another Schusterman activity. We try to keep coordinated with our counterparts at OU and do things together. So currently, Andrew Porwancher is the Ernest May Fellow in History and Policy at Harvard, doing a research project there. Before that, he was a senior research fellow at the Clements Center here at UT. He's the author of 3 books, The Devil Himself, A Tale of Honor, Insanity, and the Birth of Modern Americas, 2016, John Henry Wigmore and the Rules of Evidence from the same year. He published 2 books in 2016, and the book whose theme he will be talking about today, The Jewish World of Alexander Hamilton, a figure that's been garnering a lot of attention thanks to Lin-Manuel Miranda. And his thesis is that Alexander Hamilton was born and raised Jewish and maintained a Jewish identity. So this book is appearing this year from Princeton University Press, and it is already available for pre-order on Amazon. And also you can get a pre-glimpse of it through this talk that our speaker will give. So Andrew Porwancher.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Professor Lindstrom for inviting me, to thank the Schusterman Center, and to thank all of you for tuning in the middle of the day during what I know is a busy time of the semester. For someone who's a Sooner, I have a lot of affection for UT. My series editor in my first book, Michael Stoff, who I see has generously tuned in, is a longtime professor at UT. I did this fellowship at the Clements Center and really had such a wonderful experience down there with you folks in Austin. And so today is just the latest act of generosity that UT has extended to someone from north of the Red River. So I'm really grateful, and I'm really excited to be talking to you folks today about Alexander Hamilton. And I'm going to do something a little radical. I'm not going to use a PowerPoint. When the pandemic started, I was using a PowerPoint and it was taking up the whole screen. And so I think I'm just going to let my face do all the work today, for good or for ill. So let's delve in. Thousands of miles from the old world, on a sun-kissed island in the Caribbean, Alexander Hamilton began a most unlikely journey. Through force of will and strength of intellect, Hamilton overcame his troubles as a penniless orphan to become a vital figure in the birth of the United States. Now, historians and more recently theater audiences have been captivated by Hamilton's meteoric rise from Caribbean obscurity to American founder. And yet, vital facts about Hamilton's upbringing have remained obscured for centuries. I believe that the balance of evidence suggests that Alexander Hamilton, in all likelihood, was born and raised Jewish. And uncovering the truth about Hamilton's origins is not just a matter of historical curiosity. It provides the key to unlocking why, in his adulthood, Hamilton emerges as a singular champion of American Jewry against the forces of anti-Semitism. To make the case that Alexander Hamilton, in all likelihood, was Jewish, I have to demonstrate the likelihood that his mother was Jewish, owing to the matrilineality of Jewish identity. And we know that his mother, Rachel, was not born a Jew. So I have to make the case for the likelihood that his mother converts to Judaism prior to Alexander's birth. And my case for her conversion begins in 1745, on a Danish island in the Caribbean called St. Croix. Today, it's part of the US Virgin Islands, but it was at that time a Danish colony. And it's there that Rachel meets and marries Johann Michael Levine. It is my thesis today that the balance of evidence suggests that Johann Levine was Jewish, that Rachel converts to Judaism to marry him, and that although she bears Alexander out of wedlock to a Gentile, still she chooses to raise her son in her adopted faith of Judaism. So let us begin with Johann Levine. Hamilton scholars have long told us that Levine was not Jewish because supposedly he's not identified in the land records or census registers from St. Croix as a Jew. The problem is none of these scholars had actually bothered consulting the original Danish source material. So I learned enough Danish to read through these records. I went through 3,000 of them. What did I find? Well, it turns out that these scholars were right. Levine is not identified as Jewish in these records. And that would be problematic for my thesis today, had I not also uncovered that every other known Jew on the island is also not identified as Jewish in these records. Religion simply wasn't a category in these records. This is a great example of a piece of evidence that, disaggregated from its context, appears to tell us one thing, and when placed back in its context, we see that it tells us nothing of Johann Levine's religious identity. What else do we know about Johann Levine? Well, we know that his last name was Levine. His last name actually appears under a variety of spellings: Lavin, Lewin, Levian. And many of these spellings match letter for letter how Jews of Levitic descent spelled their surnames in the 18th century. We also know that Levine was working as a merchant, a typical Jewish profession at the time. He had been working on the Caribbean island of Nevis, which was home to a sizable Jewish community. And I uncovered in the course of my research that he was disproportionately likely to conduct business with Jews. And this at a time when Jews especially conducted business amongst themselves. And Hamilton's own grandson explicitly identifies Levine as a, quote, rich Danish Jew. So if Levine were Jewish, and there is not a shred of evidence otherwise, is it possible that Rachel converts to Judaism to marry him? Well, consider this. Rachel and Johann have a son, Peter Levine, a year after their marriage, and they do not have him infant baptized, which was standard practice for island Christians. Now, years later, as an adult, Peter Levine gets an adult baptism in the process of joining an Anglican church. Anglicans practice infant baptism. Why would Anglicans baptize an adult? There are three possible reasons why any given adult would be baptized by the Anglican church. One reason would be as if the person had grown up in a Christian sect that didn't practice infant baptism. Some Christian denominations only practice adult baptism, or what's sometimes called believer's baptism. So might Peter Levine have grown up Christian in a sect that only practices adult baptism, and he simply hadn't had his adult baptism yet, and that's why the Anglicans baptize him? No, it's not possible, because every sect on St. Croix exclusively practiced infant baptism. A second reason why Anglicans might baptize an adult is if the person had been baptized as an infant, but in a non-Trinitarian sect of Christianity. Anglicans accept as valid baptisms from other Christian sects if, and only if, those baptisms are in the name of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But not all Christian sects are Trinitarian. Could it be that Peter Levine grows up Christian, has a non-Trinitarian baptism, and that explains why in adulthood the Anglicans rebaptize him? Again, the answer is no. It is not a possibility because every Christian sect on St. Croix in this era exclusively practiced Trinitarian baptisms. The third and final reason why Anglicans would baptize an adult, the only one that could plausibly pertain to Peter Levine, is if he was converting to Christianity. Now, Hamilton scholars who are fixed on the assumption that Johann, Rachel, and Peter were cradle to grave Christians have been baffled by Peter's adult baptism. But if Johann were Jewish and Rachel converts to Judaism to marry him, then that would make Peter Jewish. And Peter's need for an adult baptism, this long-standing mystery among Hamilton scholars, is suddenly easily explained. But that's just one piece of evidence for you to consider. Now, Rachel and Johann have a deeply troubled marriage. Johann has her imprisoned for infidelity. And when she gets out of prison, she absconds from the island of St. Croix and she winds up on the British Caribbean island of Nevis. And it's there that Rachel bears Alexander out of wedlock to a Scottish colonist named James Hamilton. James unquestionably was a Gentile, but there are compelling reasons to think that Rachel chooses to raise her son Alexander in her adopted faith of Judaism. For one, if Alexander were born Jewish, we would expect that he would be circumcised. If born Christian, baptized. Now, unfortunately, there are no extant circumcision records for any Jews that were living on Nevis, but there are surviving baptismal records, and they show no entry for Alexander. But even more compelling than that is the fact that Rachel enrolls Alexander in a Jewish school where he begins rudimentary study of the Torah in the original Hebrew. When he was little, his teacher would put him on a table so they would be eye level, and he would recite to her the 10 Commandments in Hebrew. Now, Hamilton scholars have long known that there's no baptismal record. They've long known about his Jewish education. How do they make sense of these curiosities? They say, well, he was born out of wedlock, and so he must have been denied an infant baptism on account of his illegitimacy. And if he can't be baptized into the church, he can't go to the church school, and that must be why he goes to the Jewish school. This is a very neat and tidy explanation, and it's one that would be problematic for my thesis today had I not gone down to Nevis and gone through the church records and found that on Nevis and throughout the Caribbean, children born out of wedlock were indeed infant baptized. We do not have grounds for assuming that Hamilton's illegitimacy posed an obstacle to his participation in church life, his baptism, or his Christian schooling. And these scholars make a critical error in assuming that a Jewish school would have educated a child who was considered Christian. Jewish schools were, of course, religious instruments. They existed to turn Jewish children into observant Jewish adults, to cultivate in these children a strong sense of Jewish identity, to instill in these children a shared sense of Jewish peoplehood with their fellow Jews spread out across the diaspora. And there was a Talmudic prohibition, which was taken seriously, preventing Jews from teaching non-Jews the Torah. And so for all of these reasons, it would be remarkable to think that a Jewish school in this time and place would have educated a child who was considered Christian. Jewish schooling raises a presumption, perhaps an insurmountable presumption, of a child's Jewish identity at that time. What's more, the notion that a Christian child would be educated at a Jewish school runs counter to everything we know about Jewish-Christian relations in the Caribbean at this time. And I want to take a couple minutes to unpack this part of the argument because it's central to the book. In the 18th century, the Caribbean was the center of Jewish life in the Western Hemisphere. There were more Jews on a single Dutch island in the Caribbean than in the entire continent of North America. Some islands, upwards of 40% of the free population was Jewish. On Nevis, it was fully 25% Jewish, right? These may not be Boca Raton numbers, but they're respectable. So why are there so many Jews on these islands? One word: sugar. The tropical heat and rich soil of the Caribbean made these islands ideal for cultivating sugar, the era's ultimate cash crop. So lucrative was the Caribbean sugar trade that Britain generated more wealth from its tiny collection of West Indian islands than from any of its North American colonies. Indeed, than from all of its North American colonies combined. The French, in treaty negotiations, had to decide between giving up one small sugar-producing island in the West Indies or all of Canada. And they gave up all of Canada. Now, Jews were particularly well-positioned to take advantage of the opportunities that the sugar trade presented. Jews were skilled in commerce. They were fluent in multiple languages, and they were embedded in trade networks with fellow Jews on both sides of the Atlantic. Those European powers willing to stomach some kind of Jewish presence on their Caribbean colonies stood to profit for that tolerance. And so religious diversity, to the extent that we see it in places like Nevis, was not celebrated by the British. It was begrudgingly accepted in the name of cash crop cultivation. The status of these Jews was always precarious, especially as islands reached peak sugar productivity and the need for further immigration wanes. Jewish success in commerce was perceived to come at the expense of Christians, and in troubled economic times, Jews became easy scapegoats. Jewish merchants were often accused of stealing bread from the mouths of Christian children through supposedly deceptive Jewish trading practices. The geography of Jewish life in Charlestown, the main port town on Nevis where Hamilton grows up, that geography underscores how Jews occupied a separate and subordinate rung on the island hierarchy. Jews were not dispersed evenly throughout Charlestown. They were concentrated in a Jewish quarter. And this Jewish quarter was hardly the most desirable real estate in town. It was sandwiched between a jail on the one side and a mosquito-infested backwater called the Bogs on the other. This configuration is telling. Jews in many parts of Europe had dwelled in their own less desirable districts. In other words, Jews and Christians aren't coming to Nevis and creating a whole new set of social and spatial relationships between the two faiths. They are recreating patterns they already know from the old world. Patterns designed to ensure a degree of separation, religious, cultural, and geographic, between Jewish and Christian life. The site of the parish church in Charlestown underscores this premium on religious division. Now, in many places in Europe at the time, church regulations called for maximal distance between churches and synagogues. And on Nevis, there was no such regulation, and yet they choose to adhere to this convention anyway, building the church as far from the synagogue as possible, which underscores the staying power of these cultural norms that prize a segregation of Jews and Christians. So why have I taken such pains to reconstruct the tenor of the Jewish experience on Nevis? Because it strains believability to think that amid this fraught environment, the Jews of Nevis would have educated Alexander Hamilton unless they considered him one of their own. The stakes for Jews were too high. Their continued residence on Nevis, too doubtful. The politics with their Christian neighbors, too dicey for the Jews to have otherwise hazarded such a risk. Now, when Alexander Hamilton is 11, he and his mother wind up back on the island of St. Croix, and she runs a store out of the first floor of a building, and they live on the second story. And this arrangement continues for a couple years. until both mother and son fall deathly ill. They suffer together in a single bed. Now, Hamilton pulls back from the brink, but on February 19th, 1768, Rachel Levine takes her dying breath. And the details of Rachel's death and burial may be instructive for our purposes today. Now, Rachel, interestingly, was not buried in the church cemetery. Now, a burial in a Jewish cemetery was not an option on St. Croix. St. Croix was home to far fewer Jews than some of these other islands. Your only option if you were Jewish was to be buried at the home of a relative. And indeed, Rachel is buried at her sister's estate. Notably, Rachel's death is recorded under the name Rachel Levine. She had not seen Johann in 18 years, and yet she keeps this Jewish surname until her dying day, further hinting at an abiding connection to a Jewish identity. Interestingly, Rachel's name is recorded in a church register at the time of her death. Her death is recorded, that is. And Hamilton scholars have taken the recording of her death in a church register to mean, seemingly reasonably, that she was a member of that church. But what these scholars don't realize is that states don't start keeping civil records of deaths until the 19th century. And so in the 18th century, many governments are using church records as de facto civil records. And churches in turn, in order to serve the state, are recording deaths not just for members of their congregation. And so the recording of a name, especially in an area where there was not a synagogue of its own with its own records, the recording of a name in a church register was not necessarily an indication that that person was a member of that church or even a member of the Christian faith. Also, a number of Hamilton scholars note that a reverend presided over Rachel's funeral rites. And this too would be problematic for my thesis, except there's no evidence for it. Every Hamilton scholar who makes this claim just cites another Hamilton scholar who makes this claim. It is yet one more fiction in the mythology that continues to shroud our understanding of Hamilton's early years and his family history. So if Hamilton were in all likelihood Jewish in his youth, when does he start identifying as Christian? I strongly suspect that any Jewish identity he may have had died with his mother. At that point, his mother is gone. The Jewish community on Nevis that had educated him is now a distant memory. He's on St. Croix, home to far fewer Jews. A youth as plucky and precocious as Alexander Hamilton would have been disinclined to compound his troubles as a penniless orphan with a second-class religious status. And in fact, a recently unearthed trial transcript from St. Croix from the time that Hamilton is age 17 lends credence to my theory that one, he had a Jewish identity in his upbringing, and two, abandoned that Jewish identity while he was still living in the Caribbean. After his mother's death, Hamilton stays in the Caribbean from the age of 13 until the age of 18. And during those intervening years, when he's 17, he's called to give testimony in a court case on St. Croix. And he takes the witness stand and he's interrogated by a lawyer to assess Hamilton's competency to take an oath on the Christian Bible. And the lawyer says, well, are you a member of the Christian faith? And Hamilton says, yes. And the lawyer says, so you've taken communion? And Hamilton concedes that no, he's never taken communion, even though he's professing to be Anglican. Well, here's the problem with that. The Anglican book called the Book of Common Prayer, which governs Anglican rites, specifies that the paired religious rites of confirmation and communion are to take place in childhood. It would be quite an oddity for Hamilton as a 17-year-old, if he actually grew up Anglican, to have never taken communion. And in fact, the court forbids Hamilton from giving sworn testimony precisely because his Christian bona fides are insufficient. And so we see that in all likelihood, Hamilton is identifying as Christian but this affiliation with Christianity was a relatively recent newfangled endeavor. Let me mention another sidelight from Hamilton's Caribbean experience. When he's 18 years old, in August of 1772, a catastrophic hurricane brutalizes the Eastern Caribbean. Its eye passes directly over St. Croix. Amid the twin horrors of gale force winds and 70-foot waves, ships from the harbor are flung inland, homes reduced to rubble, and the lives of hundreds of islanders are summarily extinguished. The next morning, survivors find, strewn amid the wreckage, the corpses of their neighbors. The best surviving description we have of this storm comes from the pen of none other than an 18-year-old Alexander Hamilton, whose description is published in a local newspaper. And islanders are so taken by Hamilton's precocious facility with language that they raise money to send him to America for college. And he enrolls at King's College, or what we call today Columbia, in New York City. And when Hamilton gets to Columbia, he does something really interesting. He lies about his age. Every piece of evidence we have from the Caribbean suggests that he was born in mid-1754. And yet, when Hamilton gets to America, he claims to be 3 years younger. Why would he do that? Well, the average age of an incoming freshman at King's College is only 15. And so it would be understandable if Hamilton, as a penniless orphan from the Caribbean, eager to fit in, would fudge his age to, pretend to be the same age as his peers. Now, what's so interesting about this for our purposes, and I might mention that Hamilton was also very boyish in face and diminutive in stature. He only looks 15, so it's an easy deception to carry out. And what's so striking to me about this is that it tells us two important things. One, Hamilton is willing to lie about some foundational aspect of his upbringing. And two, just as importantly, Hamilton has to maintain this lie for consistency's sake for the rest of his life. And he's able to do so without any Caribbean contemporary ever calling him out, without any West Indian acquaintance ever correcting the record. And this willingness and ability to successfully obscure some aspect of his West Indian heritage makes it that much more plausible that Hamilton could similarly obscure a Jewish past with comparable success. So let's take a step back from all of this and think about what this adds up to. Now, there are people in corners of academia who will tell you, Porwancher, he's unhinged. He's gone rogue this time. He's a caricature from New Jersey, trafficking in Jewish delusion. But I take comfort in the words of another great American statesman, John Adams, who once said, facts are stubborn things. So let's take an inventory of some relevant facts. Johann Levine had a Jewish surname, a Jewish profession, came from an island with a Jewish community, conducted business with Jews, is identified by Hamilton's own grandson as a Jew. After Rachel marries him, she has a son, Peter, who's not infant baptized, who gets an adult baptism under circumstances that only make sense if he's converting to Christianity. And she has this other son, Alexander, who she enrolls at a Jewish school at a time when Jewish schools in the Caribbean exclusively educated Jewish children. She keeps this Jewish surname until her last breath. She's not buried in a church cemetery. Hamilton, as a 17-year-old, is forbidden from giving sworn testimony because he's never taken communion. And when he gets to America, we find that he's both willing and able to hide foundational aspects of his West Indian past. If we insist on adhering to the unfounded article of faith that these people were all cradle to grave Christians, these are really inconvenient facts. Hamilton biographers have glossed over these facts or used words such as shocking, mysterious, and inexplicable to describe them. Well, as my mother likes to say when things don't quite add up, that dog don't hunt. And I don't know where she got that expression from because she's a Jew from Montreal. I don't think she's ever been south of Philadelphia, but she does say that. I realized the notion that an American founder may have secretly had a Jewish identity sounds on its face a little outlandish. But my book proceeds from the foundational premise of all research, which is that the best argument is the one that accounts for the most evidence. Now, I see I have about 5 minutes left, and there's so much more that could be said about Hamilton's role in America as an ally to the American Jewish community at a time of anti-Semitism. And I'm happy to discuss any aspect of what I've talked about already, or Hamilton's relationship with the Jewish community in New York City and in America during the Q&A, whatever people want to talk about. But let me take these last few minutes and say just a couple words about what I see as some of the striking parallels between the history of the Jewish people and Hamilton's own unlikely story. Now, during the diaspora, Jews were, of course, outsiders in other societies. In civilizations where power was rooted inland, Jews could not own land. Jews had to be intermediaries, tradesmen between societies who cultivated linguistic and financial acumen by virtue of their marginality. And for those Jews who made it to America in the early years of the Republic, they held out some faith that this new Republic could be their new Jerusalem. So it was with Hamilton. He too knew what it meant to live on the margins. He too cultivated his skills in finance and in languages in order to survive. And he too was a wanderer who hoped to find in America a new redemptive homeland. Hamilton once wrote of the Jewish people, quote, "The entire history and progress of the Jews has been and is entirely out of the ordinary course of human affairs. Is it not then a fair conclusion that the cause is an extraordinary one? In other words, that it is the effect of some great providential plan." Perhaps Hamilton saw some divine intervention in his own improbable rise from Caribbean obscurity to American founder. Yet it was precisely because Hamilton and his Jewish allies were outsiders that they were able to become consummate modernizers. In a world that was largely rural, they flocked to urban life. In a world that was primarily agrarian, they were drawn to trade and finance. In a world where loyalties often lay with your local state first and the country at large second, Hamilton and his Jewish allies believed in the promise of a unified American nation. It has been said that if you want to see a monument to Thomas Jefferson, you can go up to the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and there you will find carved from white marble a beautiful memorial honoring the author of the Declaration of Independence. But if you want to see a monument to Hamilton, look all around you every day. We are living in the world that he envisioned. What Hamilton understood was that the American future belonged not to the children of plantation aristocrats, it belonged to the itinerant, to the commercial, to the enterprising, to the multilingual, to the cosmopolitan, to the urban. It belonged to people like him. It belonged to people like his Jewish allies. If Jews were not yet fully accepted in the America of Hamilton's day, they surely could be in the America of Hamilton's dream. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Very interesting talk. Now I'm definitely going to get hold of the book and find out all the details, everything that didn't fit into 35 minutes. I've absolutely got to read it. So we've started having some questions in chat. Greg Lipscomb, our very faithful audience member here at the Schusterman Center, what were a few key indicators in his adult life that might indicate a Jewish upbringing?
Yeah, this is such a great question, and I really appreciate it. I think there are really two central aspects of Hamilton's adulthood that give some hint of his upbringing. And I might mention, just as an aside, it's always striking to me that historians are, and not all of them, but a lot of them, I think, are a little bit shy about writing about childhood. And that's partly because it can be difficult to draw really concrete connections between childhood and adulthood, and because children often aren't keeping really copious diaries, although Theodore Roosevelt, by the way, actually did as a child. And so there's an absence of historical material. And I think we really miss something important in that regard. And I think we can find echoes of Hamilton's childhood all throughout his adulthood. He's working for an import-export company in his adolescence when other founders are growing up on plantations versed in a feudal form of economy. He is learning about credit, debt, trade, finance. He's honing all the skills that would uniquely position him to become the visionary of America's financial future. He's surrounded by the brutalities of Caribbean slavery, which I think can't help but inform his later attitude towards slavery. He becomes, as a child, really interested in martial glory. And I have to imagine that has some bearing on his eagerness to fight in the war when it breaks out after he moves to America. And I think that any Jewish upbringing he had, of course, like all of these other aspects, has a residue in his adulthood. And so I really appreciate you asking that question. So to circle back, the two aspects of his adulthood that I find most compelling is that, one, he has the closest relationship to the American Jewish community of any founder. He implements reforms at his alma mater, Columbia, that are friendly to Jews. He puts the first Jew on the college board, for instance. He opens up the college presidency to Jews, opens the eligibility in a way that isn't true of other colonial era colleges until the 20th century. He is working closely with Jews in building the modern American financial system. He's the most outspoken critic of anti-Semitism among any of the founders. And so I think that relationship with American Judaism is a pretty strong echo of his childhood. But the other thing I would note is Hamilton's relative ambivalence towards Christianity. He marries a pious Christian woman in Elizabeth Schuyler, and even rents a pew for her at Trinity Church in Manhattan, but his name never appears next to hers in the communion books. He doesn't actually join the church. He keeps a relative distance from church life in his adulthood. And, it's conceivable that Hamilton just found church liturgy stale, but I think it's equally plausible that a Jewish upbringing made Hamilton resistant to little more than a nominal pretense to a Christian identity. So thank you so much for that question. And Professor Lindstrom, should I just keep going to the chat box for more questions?
Absolutely.
Okay. So the next question is, can I say more about his relationship to his brothers, especially the one born to Levine? Is there evidence of affinity from them to Judaism? So this is another really good question. So Hamilton actually has two brothers, and I really had to do violence to the book. I spent 7 years researching, writing the book, and 35 minutes presenting. So as you can imagine, there's a nuance and a level of detail in the book. And so I'm not just telling you that to try to pitch you on buying it, but it's just a reality. And so I didn't get to mention his other brother. So with Peter Levine, we don't know so much about him. We do know that he moves to South Carolina and joins this Anglican church and gets an adult baptism, which is a very strong indicator that he's converting to Christianity. The other thing we know about Peter Levine is that he dies young. And, Hamilton is dispossessed of his inheritance from his mother because he's born out of wedlock, and the court in St. Croix, at the behest of Johann Levine, awards the entirety of the estate to Johann's son, Peter. And then when Peter dies, he leaves Hamilton a pittance and disposes most of what's left of Rachel's estate to other people whom Alexander Hamilton doesn't even know. And Hamilton, even though he's not hard up for money at this point in his life, he's an adult when this happens, he writes this really pained letter to his wife, Eliza, in which all of these old demons from the Caribbean resurface. And he's, for the second time in his life, is robbed of his mother's inheritance. And I think for him, it's less about the pecuniary value of the inheritance and more about its symbolic value. And so we see in this pained letter that he writes to Eliza, yet another echo of his childhood and his adulthood. As for his other brother, James Hamilton, we only know a couple of things about him. One, after Rachel's death, James is apprenticed to a carpenter, and he pretty much disappears from the historical record until the mid-1780s, when he resurfaces with a letter to Alexander asking Alexander for money. And Alexander is so desperate to bring James back into his life that he says, I'll cheerfully pay your draft upon me for 50 pounds sterling, and I'll do anything to convince you that I have the loyalty of a brother. And it's pretty striking because in the same letter, Hamilton chastises James a bit for having not been in touch. And then when he's only in touch, it's to get money. But Hamilton is so eager to hold on to some vestige of his family of origin that he's willing, in response to his brother's self-serving correspondence, to use it as an occasion to demonstrate his own fraternal devotion. And the one, to get more directly to your question, the one piece of evidence that perhaps indicates a Jewish identity on James Hamilton's part, we don't know if he went to the Jewish school. We do know there's no surviving baptismal record for James, but we also know that he writes this letter hitting up Alexander for money from the Danish Caribbean island of St. Thomas, which was home to one of the more sizable Jewish communities in the Caribbean. So perhaps that's something of a hint, but unfortunately, we're dealing with a very fragmentary record. And both at the start of this talk, when I talked about the balance of evidence, and in the book, I really stress that the historical record is fragmentary. We're dealing with scraps of evidence, and my claims are probabilistic. They're not certain. And I'm glad that you asked these questions, but because it throws into high relief the limits of the historical record and the humility that we have to have when hazarding claims about it. So let me look at the next question, and thank you everybody for these terrific questions. I'm curious about Rachel's motives for remaining Jewish when her marriage was unpalatable. You know, this is such an interesting question. And again, here the historical record raises more questions than it answers. But in the book, I do speculate about this. And I suspect that Rachel is identifying as Jewish on Nevis more for strategic reasons than for spiritual ones. I think that Rachel, who came from, and I talk about this in the book, but she comes from a family that may not have the best reputation on Nevis because her parents got a divorce at a time when that was uncommon. And she and her mother end up, you know, she actually grows up on Nevis and she leaves as a 16-year-old to go to St. Croix. And then she has Alexander out of wedlock. And so based on her parents' history, on her own history, you know, she may not be the most, she may be a little bit on the margins. And I wonder if she found it convenient to trade on an earlier conversion to Judaism from St. Croix as a way of securing some measure of acceptance for herself and her son in some community on Nevis. And so, you know, Rachel and Alexander in many ways are marginal people. And the idea that they may have found it convenient or expedient to be on the margins of different faiths at different times in their life is, I believe, wholly consistent with what we do find in the historical record. So that's a terrific question, and that's my best guess at an informed answer. So thank you for that. It looks like I'm not. Oh, let me look at this chat box here for the next question. Is there any evidence of his influence on George Washington that might have led to the Toro Letter Synagogue? This is another question I'm so glad that somebody asked, because I have an entire chapter on it on the book. Another reason to get the book. So let me say a brief word about this letter. So in 1790, George Washington pens a letter to the Jews of the Toro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. And this letter is hugely significant for a lot of reasons. One, he has this very famous line where he says, the government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. And this is reflective of George Washington's pluralistic approach to America's religious diversity in the very early years of his administration, when the power of precedent was at its zenith. And this is also an important letter because Washington in this text becomes the first head of state anywhere in the world to acknowledge Jews as citizens. It had never been done before. Now, and some people would call this letter the most significant document in American Jewish history, and I would be inclined to agree. Everybody who writes about a founder wants to touch the magic. They all want to claim that the founder they're studying had some influence on it. Jefferson scholars think, oh, this bears Jefferson's imprint. Madison people say that. This may surprise you to hear, but I think Hamilton was the most likely influence on the Newport letter. But I've got some reasons why. First, Hamilton is closer to the Jewish community than anyone else in Washington's orbit. Secondly, the letter is addressed specifically to Moses Seixas at the Newport Synagogue, after Moses Seixas, during a visit that Washington had made to Newport, reads a speech aloud to Washington on behalf of Rhode Island's Jews. Hamilton has a pre-existing relationship with the Seixas family. Moses Seixas's brother Gershom is the very Jew who Hamilton puts on the Columbia board, the first time that a Jew had sat on the board of a college at any time in American history. So Hamilton knows the family. And interestingly, the letter also makes a really important distinction between mere religious toleration and genuine religious liberty. And Washington endorses the former and endorses the latter and eschews the former. And that is a distinction to which Hamilton himself is sensitive. And Hamilton himself is on record writing about the need to go beyond mere tolerance to genuine religious freedom, where you're not merely tolerated, but even if you're a religious minority, you're on an equality with the majority. And so for all of these reasons, I think Hamilton is arguably as likely an influence as anyone else. So that's a really terrific question. Let's continue with the chat. Let's see here. What is the significance of my finding that his class was as much a source of marginality? So you could elaborate on what the implication of his Jewishness is. What is the significance that his class was a source of marginality?
So what I was asking was, Andrew, and you actually started answering now in some of the other questions.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
You talked about his Jewishness maybe being the source of his marginality and this kind of different perspective he might have brought, right? So I'm an East Europeanist, so I don't know the details of this, but as I heard you speak about him and his mother and his upbringing, his class, and when he became a teenager was as much a source of his marginality as his Jewishness. So I'm just trying to understand if you have, as I think you persuasively sort of documented, I'm Danish, by the way, that he was Jewish. What does it mean? Like, so what's the takeaway in some ways? But I think you started answering that in terms of the sort of social circles he would move in later on, perhaps.
Sure. And I would just, I actually love getting to speak to Danish people about this, because I think I might be one of the few people looking at the role of Danish colonial history in the American founding. So I think, yeah. So I would speak to what you just said, which is Hamilton's adult relationships with Jewry. But I think what's really interesting about your question is that, class can be based on religion, and it can also be based on economics, and these things can interact in interesting ways. And Jews are both, and I think this is so true of so much of Jewish history, Jews are both, principal and peripheral. They're both privileged and marginalized, often at the same time. And Jews are making a living in a Caribbean society where they're also discriminated against. And they're certainly far better off than the slaves, but they're not really on an equality with their Christian neighbors. And so, it wouldn't surprise me that in a world where, Alexander or Rachel may be marginal in some respects for reasons that have nothing to do with religion, that it may be that there's some security to be had in identifying with a marginal community that's at least economically sufficient. And so these things, I do think, interact in interesting ways. Precisely how that plays out in the life of Alexander Hamilton and his relatives, the precise details, I think, are unknowable owing to the limits of the historical record. But what I would say that's interesting about Hamilton, that I think is very sort of Jewish of him, is that even when he's the Treasury Secretary, even when he's the most powerful person in the country, he's still derided for being an outsider. He's still maligned for being an immigrant. He's still a marginal figure. And what's so tragic about Alexander Hamilton is his willingness to hazard his life in a duel with Aaron Burr. Here was someone who had, achieved military heroics on the battlefield, had achieved extraordinary policy achievements in government, and yet it was never enough. Only glory and death could provide him what the feats of a lifetime could not. And I think he was always haunted by this marginal status that you're talking about. And so it's a really interesting question, and it's one that I talk a little bit more about in the book. So I really appreciate that, and thank you for clarifying with your comments. Let's go on to the next question. So these are just some nice comments. So thank you to Bernice and Barbara, and thank you to Professor Stove. Someone mentions that we're going through some of the same tension today between tolerance and freedom, and I think that's certainly true. And maybe I could say one word about that, which is that when the neo-Nazis were marching through the streets of Charlottesville a couple years ago and chanting "Jews will not replace us," encoded in that comment, in those 5 words, is a rendition of American history, a story of American history that says people of their ethnic descent came first and Jews came later, that people of their background founded the country and Jews are outsiders, they're interlopers who are challenging the character of the country. And one reason I think that it could be valuable today to recover the story of Alexander Hamilton and his ties to the American Jewish community is that it can be an important reminder that Jews have been a part of the American experiment since its very inception, and that the history that is animating this kind of neo-Nazism today, it's not just morally repugnant, it's factually inaccurate, and it's high time that the narrative that they're peddling be thoroughly debunked for the myth that it is. So Barbara, I appreciate your comments about modern times. Jay asks, is Lin-Manuel Miranda familiar with your research? So, I actually had an opportunity. I was in New York. It was 2015. The musical was in previews. It hadn't even premiered on Broadway. And I was researching for the book in archives in the city. And I was actually living just a couple blocks from the theater where Hamilton was on. And you could go up and get tickets at face value the day of. Again, it hadn't even had its premiere. And I thought, wow, a musical about Alexander Hamilton. When is there ever going to be a more gimmicky musical that shuts down after 2 weeks? This is my one chance to see it before it shuts down forever. And so I went to see it, and the cast would hang out after the show and chat with people. And so I actually did get to briefly chat with Lin-Manuel Miranda about my research. And he was a busy guy, so it was a quick conversation, and he was very friendly and encouraging. But I got to have more in-depth conversations with a couple other cast members, including Daveed Diggs, who is half African-American, half Jewish. And his Jewish mother was actually in the audience. And then she joined our conversation. And you can imagine Daveed Diggs was really interested in a conversation about the complexities of Jewish identity, as was his mother. And so I got to chat with them for like 20 or 30 minutes about my research. And that was really fun. So, it's been great to see so many people getting interested in Alexander Hamilton thanks to the musical. And so I was saying to Professor Lindstrom earlier before I hopped on to this event, how I'm really indebted to Lin-Manuel Miranda for having generated just extraordinary interest in the subject matter, especially among young people. And so I'm actually working on a study abroad class right now on Nevis that will focus on the role of Hamilton's childhood in his adulthood. And so we'll see if people sign up. I'm cautiously optimistic. Okay.
Andrew, could I ask
Yes.
you a question? You didn't get to the end of my comments.
Oh,
So there is a question at the very end, though it has nothing to do with Hamilton, about which we've talked a fair amount over the years. Could you tell me a little bit about your Roosevelt book? What's your take on Roosevelt? Are we going to learn that TR is really Jewish?
so wait, here's what I can tell. Well, first off, I have to tell folks, I'm hugely indebted to Michael Stoff and always will be. He took a chance on a first-time author, and advocated for me to get my first book deal with Oxford University Press, and which led to my getting tenure. And so I've known Michael for several years now, and he's as good an editor as I've ever had. So it's really nice to see him. And yes, I see the bottom of your comments now. So I am working on a book right now, tentatively titled Theodore Roosevelt and the Jews, also with Princeton. And this is a book that in many ways is about the deep origins of Russian disinformation. And I uncover a Russian attempt to meddle in American politics during the administration of Theodore Roosevelt. And during that time in 1903, as many of you who study Jewish history in the 20th century will know, a time of terrible pogroms. And after the Kishinev pogrom, perhaps the most notorious of the early 20th century pogroms, there's an extraordinary outcry for Roosevelt to do something on the world stage. And what's really interesting is that the Russians get really nervous about this, and they start peddling lies, just telling brazen lies to the American papers, going over Roosevelt's head, going outside diplomatic channels in a bid to manipulate American public opinion and the American press and the American president. And this drives a huge wedge between the president and his State Department. And in this case, the president was more antagonistic towards Russia, and his State Department wanted to be more conciliatory. And so Roosevelt boxes the State Department out, and he ends up relying on his own inexperienced daughter for foreign policy advice. And he has his 19-year-old daughter helping him write out word for word cables to the US ambassador in St. Petersburg. So this is very much a book still in progress. It was supported by the Clements Center at UT, and I'm now in the course of trying to wrap up a manuscript there. And as we all know, books take longer than we expect, but I'm hoping to get it out in the next 2 to 3 years. But it's been a really fun book to write, in part because of its contemporary relevance, in part because Roosevelt is such an interesting character, and in part because it's a really rich window into the relationship between domestic electoral politics at a time when Jews are actually becoming a really important voting bloc, and American foreign policy. And I think we find, Roosevelt is neither, the lionized figure that we sometimes find in popular airport biographies. Neither is he quite, the simplistic, demonic figure that he's sometimes described by scholars. And I think it is uniquely his relationship with American Jews that brings to light the complexities and the contradictions of Roosevelt and of his administration. So it's been a hugely fun book to work on. There's a lot of very human anecdotes. His boxing coach is actually a Jewish prize fighter. He owns a couple menorahs. He actually is, those of you familiar with Israel Zangwill, who writes, the British playwright who writes the famous play, The Melting Pot. Roosevelt goes to a show, and he writes Zangwill, and he makes some suggestions for changing some lines in the play. And Zangwill actually takes on board the suggestions and rededicates the play to Theodore Roosevelt. And so he's got really fascinating relationships with Jews from all walks of life, and men and women, Americans and European Jews. And so if there's interest, come 2023 or 2024, I'd love to come back to Austin, maybe in physical form by that point, if folks are interested in hearing more about that. And Michael notes, I may consider writing a book on the craft of narrative history, which is really, I think, what drew Michael and I together and still draws us together is that we both care so much about not just the substance of history, but the craft of telling a great story. And he's been a great mentor and friend on that regard. So thank you for that, Michael.
Well, let me just say before I leave that for those of you who haven't read any of Andrew's work, he's a beautiful writer. And I imagine and look forward to reading it myself. I imagine the Hamilton book is as good, if not better, than the Oxford book, but the man has talent.
Thank you so much.
Very nice. Do we have any further comments that you would like Andrew Porwancher to field? If not, thank you so much, Andrew, for virtually coming to visit us. And I do hope we see you in person one of these years. Great talk, great job fielding all the questions. And also, it's been really good to see some of our longtime audience members come back, people who stuck with our lecture series year after year. So I hope next year we see you all in person. Okay.
And thank you for a non-PowerPoint approach. You're a good dynamic speaker, and it did the job marvelously.
Thank you so much for that comment, and thank you to Professor Lindstrom and to Galit and everybody for tuning in. It's been such a pleasure. Don't tell my provost I said such nice things about the Longhorns, but I really do have an affection for UT. And as a Schusterman Center member, it's great to do this with the Schusterman Center especially. So thank you so much, everybody.
Great. Okay. Goodbye, all.